sitting next to me, who's co-organising these events, and also Nick Ribbons from Zero Waste Scotland, who's been supporting this event and providing us with this Zoom platform. So thank you for that. And yeah, I'm sure, I think a few of us heard him last week when he was talking, or not last week, 2 weeks ago when he was talking about the circular economy. It's great to have such a good audience, and again we're fully booked for tonight. We'll be recording this talk, as Rachel Bailey just said, and we're putting it on YouTube, so you can spread the word among your friends if anyone else wants to listen to the talk, and pass it on to your landscaper so you can have a look if he's interested as well, to spread the word as much as possible. And yeah, also if you don't want to be recorded, you may have heard Rachel, but just switch off your video screen so that you're not seen. If you've got any questions during the talk, it would really help to save them to the end, but put them in the chat box and we'll address them then. To help sift through the questions, it's useful to put a Q at the beginning of a question, an A if you're answering a question, and C for a comment. And then just, to say that as garden designers, we're in a really good position to create gardens and landscapes that are good for the planet and also for all of us inhabiting it. And it just maybe requires a bit of forethought and changes to the way that we are designing, specifying and building gardens at the moment. So for the fourth of our webinar series, looking at sustainable design solutions for the landscape industry in response to a climate crisis, I'd like to welcome Professor Colin Campbell, who's Chief Executive at the Hutton Institute in Dundee, and he's going to talk to us about soil, the climate crisis, and the landscape industry, about how we can create a healthy soil, or what is a healthy soil, and the value of diversity of soils rather than just having a well-drained loam that we all kind of aspire to, and possibly the idea of making growing medium using construction waste and materials, so working with what we've got a bit again, and maybe ways to reduce our carbon footprint in other ways. Colin he's had 28 years research experience in soil microbiology and soil science, mainly looking in an agricultural environment, and is very interested in sustainable development. So is very well placed to talk to us tonight on this subject, and we're really grateful that he's prepared to come in and chat to us at the end of a long day of work. So at this point, I'm happy to hand over to Colin and take over from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca and Nick and Rachel, for the opportunity. I do appreciate that it's a long day, especially with the lockdown, when you have family and to look after and work to do and everything. So real privilege to get the chance to talk to you today about one of my favourite subjects. Can I just check that you can hear me okay, if somebody could nod? Yeah, and I am sharing the screen. I'm just going to put it into presentation mode. Are you looking at 2 slides or one?
2 slides.
2 slides, right. Are you looking at 1 slide now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the importance of soil in respect to climate crisis. This is a subject that we do a lot of work on at the James Hutton Institute. You're a very different audience for me to talk to, actually, but it's a real privilege because I think, garden design is one of these things that can give joy to people, and people who've got access to a garden now, whether it's a public garden or a private garden, that's a huge support in these times of the lockdown. So more power to your elbow, and good luck with everything that you do. In terms of this talk, I'm going to talk about the Institute a little bit, if you don't mind. I just want to introduce you because I suspect you've not many of you have heard of us. I'm going to talk about the global and the local challenge and the urgency of the climate crisis, and why we need really big changes in the way in which we manage our land. And what's the importance of soils within all of that? And that's the thing that we've got in common with you, is the importance of soils. And I'm really going to emphasize the life within the soil, because it's fascinating to me. And and I'll maybe take a bit of a kind of tour of the inner space of soils at that point. Then I'm going to go back to the climate emergency and talk about some of the kind of transformational land uses and ways we can maybe get things that we want from soil and from land in a different way in the future. And then I'm going to touch on the end about some of the principles about what's a healthy soil in relation to the sort of urban context. So we'll get going. And my first slide, actually, I want to ask you, has anybody ever heard of who James Hutton? Yeah, there's a few nodding heads. But James Hutton's actually one of Scotland's most famous ever scientists, but nobody knows that. And probably one of the two most important scientists we've ever produced. He was a leading figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, which was this golden age of intellectual and scientific achievement. And he worked in many, many areas of science, as many of the people at that time did. They were real polymaths. But he discovered deep time, which is the concept that the Earth, couldn't be measured in thousands of years. It had to be massively old, and of course at the time that was quite controversial in relation to the Bible. But he was also a founder of modern geology as a result of that, and he was one of the first to ever describe the Earth as a living system. So for us, he's a fabulous inspirational figure as a scientist. He was also a farmer, and he was very pragmatic, so a great figurehead for our institute. And what we do is what we call long-term mission-orientated research, and that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's about focusing on the long-term outcome of a more sustainable land. And we are an independent research organisation, a charity and a limited company, and we do research 100%. We don't teach, we're not a university. And the way we talk about this long-term research is because change in our environment and land use takes a long time. Although when I talk about climate change, I'm going to say we need to get a move on, but it generally takes decades to see changes. And if you're going to come up with strategic solutions, whether it's breeding new varieties or long-term experiments, it takes decades to really do that. So you need to have a long-term perspective on the science that you do and the research that you do. And obviously, if you're working in biology, experiments quite often go wrong, and you need to have several goes at it and look at things over a long term. So we do a lot of gathering of primary data through national surveys, long-term experiments, long-term observations over decadal periods, and we try and model and predict as best we can on an enhanced understanding of how our natural world works, and that's what we do. And some of the photographs there just show you some of our colleagues who work in different ways in glasshouses, fields, peat bogs, up and down greenhouse gas flux towers and the like. Now, I think everybody's probably based in the UK, so you'll recognise the top half of the UK here. And we're based primarily in Dundee and Aberdeen, but we also have 3 research farms. And we have about 500 people that are employed at the James Hutton Institute. There's probably another 200 associated as students or visitors. And we cover a full diversity of scientific disciplines. So there's a lot of things there you would expect to see in terms of crop science, soil science, physics, chemistry. But you also see sociology, environmental psychology, and we're increasingly employing people who have social sciences because a lot of the problems we're working on are to do with people, and it's people's behaviours and people's choices that actually cause the problems, and it's changing behaviours that will actually get the solutions. Now, as well as all these glasshouses and labs, we've got some very specific scientific resources that I'll just tell you about briefly. Something called the National Soils Archive. You can see that. Actually, I'm looking at the wrong one. You can see it here. It's a store of over 50,000 soil samples collected since the 1930s from all over Scotland, of every soil type there is in Scotland. There's a National Soils database. I don't know if you see, there's a picture here with some very strange looking objects of different colours. These are actually potato tubers, and they come from the Commonwealth Potato Collection. Again, a collection from the 1930s from South America, and they're wild varieties of potatoes. But we use those to try and breed new varieties of potatoes. So again, very long-term objectives in terms of how we do our science. But it does result in new things. So new crop varieties, for example, these are some of the crop varieties we produce. And we're forever producing new maps of Scotland, whether it's the topography, the soil types, increasingly socioeconomic data. We make all these data freely available to people who want to use it. It includes the private sector and the public sector. But for all of that sort of main work that we do, there's some surprising extras I wanted to just briefly mention. So all the black currants that you get in Ribena have been bred by the James Hutton Institute. There's 5 different varieties of black currants used in Ribena. The last 25 years, 100% of our varieties. So big economic impact as well. We collaborate with private companies on developing new products. So the photograph in the middle there is of Natar gin, which is the first climate positive gin in the world. And it's climate positive because they've used peas to make carbohydrate they've used in the fermentation to make the gin. And that replaces the importation of soybean in terms of animal feed, and replaces the barley and replaces the fertilizer that's normally used. So it's climate positive. But we also have a huge analytical capability, and some of our staff here, there's a picture there of a chap called Steve Hillier holding up the World Cup for analysing soils, basically. And having the ability to do that can result in unusual applications. So the next picture is a picture of Professor Lorna Dawson, who's a criminal soil forensic scientist. And we have worked on over 100 criminal cases, tracing soil evidence and sometimes tracing bodies, sadly, based on soil evidence to try and help the police. And some of our analytical capabilities even used to look at helicopter gearboxes and make sure they're safe to fly out of Aberdeen Airport to the oil and gas sector. So, you know, a lot of different extras that come from having that long-term research and capability. And we always say we work in Scotland, but it's from the world to the world and back again. And this is an actual map of the various places that we do work across the world. And just to reassure you all as taxpayers that for every pound of public funding we get, we give back £12.75 to the UK economy. So vote for research funding when you next hear about it. So that's just a brief overview. But why do we do what we do? Well, this is one of the reasons why we do what we do, and that is there is a global crisis, and you know the population is growing. But I wouldn't want to give you the impression population growing is the problem. It's the consumption by people which is the problem. And we are predicting that we'll need a 50% increase in food and a 50% increase in energy to meet this growing demand, and an increase in fresh water need as well, 30%. And we'll need an awful lot more land to grow the food and materials we actually need. And that's all happening at the same time as we have a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And the species in the world are now going extinct faster than any time in the last couple of hundred years. I mean, we really do have a dual crisis in terms of nature and climate. So these are massive global challenges that we are working on and trying to help solve. And as I say, it's not a question of producing enough food. We actually produce enough food. If you think about it, there is actually more overweight and obese people in the world than there are starving people now. So we produce enough food, and we actually waste about 30% of it as well. So it's not all about production, it's about overconsumption. And we need to get on top of that. And of course, COVID-19 has amply demonstrated how unresilient we are when nature bites us back. And that's because of ecosystem degradation and overconsumption, really. So the United Nations have called this the crisis of our time, our climate change and biodiversity loss. But it's not all doom and gloom. Actually, there's a huge opportunity to manage the world in a completely new way. They've declared that the next decade is the decade of ecosystem restoration, and restoration can remove up to 26 gigatons of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and offers an unparalleled opportunity to create jobs. So you need to look at this from an optimistic point of view. We need to get it right, and there's every opportunity we can have a better world, get employment going, get the economy going, but in a completely new way. And what I would like to suggest to you next is that soils are a really important part of this. And in fact, if you look at the history of soil degradation, it has been responsible for the collapse of civilizations in the past. You know, you look through historical records, some great books out there actually about the collapse of civilizations. A lot of them have got to do with soil erosion, Viking settlements in Greenland and Iceland. And in fact, in the US, when they had the Dust Bowls in the 1930s, it prompted a massive new conservation movement in the United States around soils. And Franklin D. Roosevelt very famously said, the history of every nation is eventually written in the way in which it cares for its soil, and the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. You would think we'd learned the lesson because that was said a very long time ago, but it appears not. And where you go in the world, you can see some massive soil degradation. I took this picture in Kenya, I think it was probably about 13 years ago now. And in places like Kenya, soils are very much a fundamental part of that country's natural capital. In fact, they can make up 70% of the value of the natural capital in terms of the wealth of a nation in developing countries. and they're very slow to form, but they can be destroyed very quickly. When I took this photograph, see if I don't know if you can see the pointer, it gives you an idea of the scale. That's a goat that's grazing up here, just at the top. And these trees aren't growing in this gully, they actually fell in there. This erosion actually happened within the space of 3 years. So massive degradation over a very short period of time. And we really can't afford to do that too much. Now, we are starting to appreciate that soils are important for a lot more things other than just growing things. And this diagram from the FAO sort of divides it into the ecological functions and the sort of non-ecological or anthropogenic functions. In terms of functions of soil, we've got biomass production. We recognise that in terms of agriculture and forestry. But it also does a lot of storing, filtering and transforming of nutrients, substances and water. It's a real filter. And really importantly, it's acting as a carbon pool, and it's also a bank of biodiversity and supports rare habitats. It can also be an archive of heritage value, a source of raw materials, and clearly it's the physical and cultural environment for humans and their activities. If you look at a soil map and you spot the good soils, you will find that's where the cities have been developed and the towns have been developed, around the good soil. So it determines our civilization. Now, to put this into a Scottish context, what does it actually mean in terms of natural capital value? Well, in terms of this provisioning or providing food, you can put numbers on it. 3 billion in terms of gross agricultural output, 670 million for forestry. That's fairly straightforward. When it comes to all these other things, it's much harder to put a pound sign on it. But storing and filtering water, we can calculate that Scottish soils in the top 1 metre store 40 billion cubic metres of water. Now, to give you an idea how much water that is, that's more than the water than you'll find in all the lochs in Scotland. That's what it's storing. And that causes flooding and causes drought. How do you put a value on it? But they also filter and transform thousands and thousands of acidifying, polluting compounds. How do you put a price on that in terms of a treatment facility? And here's the really big one that we're concerned about as well. In Scotland, they store 3,000 megatons of carbon. Now that's equivalent to 186 years of Scotland's total carbon dioxide emissions. You don't want to lose any more of that carbon from that soil. And in fact, you want to be able to store a lot more. And thankfully, you can store more carbon there. And then there's other things you can't put a pound sign on. These wonderful habitats in the flow country and the Machair, and the fact that there's a huge diversity in the soil, which I'll talk more about, let alone the cultural significance of some of our historic soils. But I want to give you an example about how you maybe can value these things. This is an old example from The Economist, where New York realised that changing agricultural practices meant they would need to preserve the quality of the city's drinking water. They had 2 options. One was to install new filtration plants, $4 to $6 billion cost, annual running cost $250 million. Option 2 was to spend $250 million buying the land, the catchment, and managing it and paying the farmers to minimise the water pollution. That was going to be $100 million. Guess which one they chose? Option 2, without a doubt. It's a great article. It kind of demonstrates there's a different way of doing this and a different way of valuing it. And I hope you're convinced by now that soil sustains life on our planet. You, me, and everything we eat, drink, and make and use. Sorry, I'll just go back. That is a challenge. You can trace every one of those items in that photograph back to soil. It's not obvious for them all, but you can. Maybe something to do later. But now I want to talk a bit about what soil is actually made of. And apologies, because I know you know this, but there's a point to the way I'm going to build this up. Clearly, it's made of rocks and minerals, living dead plant material and water. But you can see straight away those photographs don't equal the photograph that you have with the soil. And there's not one soil, but there are many soil types. This is just soil profiles showing differences in colour, differences in stratification, very, very different types of soil. So we always say there's not one but many soils. And in fact, soils of Scotland are very diverse. We have a very diverse geology. And they're also relatively young in global terms compared to, say, in the tropics. And it all depends on the geology, the slope, the climate, the plant types, and the soil biota. And particularly, as James Hutton recognised, time, and that deep time is really important. It can take decades, if not hundreds of years, to form certain types of soil. If you have 1 metre of peat, you're talking about 1,000 years of peat formation. And unfortunately, the rate of loss is very much greater than the rate of formation. So soils really need to be regarded as essentially a non-renewable resource. I'll just show you briefly the soil map of Scotland. You can see from the many colours there, the different types and the distribution of those types. And if I tell you there's actually about 600 soil types in Scotland alone, you get an idea about the diversity. And what that means is all these soils have got different personalities. And this is just an online resource that we use in education, which uses characters to demonstrate to people that every soil has a different personality and behaviour, and you need to understand that personality and behaviour if you want to manage the soil. So that's all online. There's also some videos of some of the soil characters. But for me as a microbiologist, the really important thing about soil is it's a living system. In fact, soil is absolutely teeming with life. A single gram of soil has got 10 to the 9 bacteria, tens of thousands of meters of fungi, tens of thousands of protozoa and nematodes, untold numbers of viruses, mites, worms, larvae. It's the greatest diversity on the planet. It's also home to the largest living organism on the planet. And I'll just pause a moment. Anybody got a guess about what the largest living organism on the planet is that you find in soil?
Fungi, mycorrhiza.
Yeah, very, very, very close. Well done. It's actually a colony of the fungus Armillaria ostea, the honey mushroom. It grows in the top one.
Fungus.
It's a fungus, yeah. Grows in the top 1 metre of soil in Canada, and it's been estimated to cover 2,200 acres, the same single fungus. It's a colony that is probably about 2,400 years old, and maybe as old as 7,000 years old. So soil's got amazing biodiversity in it. And in the next slide, just a few photographs of the variety of life that you find in soil. And we have hardly explored much of this biodiversity. It really is a true megadiversity, and it's really important to appreciate soil as a living thing. And what that means is that soil is a bioreactive filter, and that's what gives it these really important ecological functions in the way that it regulates greenhouse gases, stores water, and transforms pollutants and contaminants. And a lot of it's to do with this mineral matter, the gravel, the sand, the silt, and the clay. And clays can be incredibly important. They have a massive surface area themselves. 10 grams of clay would cover a football pitch, for example. And this massive surface area, coupled with the life in soil, is what makes it such an effective bioreactive filter. But it's very highly organised. I'm going to show you next a thin section of the soil. So this is under a microscope. It's a thin section of the soil, which is showing that it's actually highly organised in a kind of landscape all of its own. And there are pores which are flush with air. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. They're flushed with air. They're flushed with water intermittently, great floods of water going past. There are root channels that are being developed by growing roots. And the microorganisms are distributed throughout that in these niches and spaces. And you can see here the clay layers on this air pore, because it's flushed by water, have actually created a beach. I don't know if you can see the different layers there. It's like a beach inside this pore. So here you have a microenvironment, which is a landscape for all these living things. And if you disturb this and you plough it or you till it or cultivate it, you're shaking up their world really big time. So one of the things that is starting to sink in with people is that we actually should disturb soils far less than we've ever done before. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But because there's this huge inner space in soils, it's something like a desert, and all the real activity is around plant roots. And this is where plants are hugely important for fueling soil in terms of the life in the soil. And you see a huge diversity. This is a mycorrhizal fungi. And in various parts of this, we can focus in with the microscope and see all sorts of different types of life living in a very organized structure. And of course, it's not static. They actually move. And the next slide, if it works, I don't know if you can see a movie there. These are soil protozoa, which are bumping into a piece of organic matter. They're actually knocking bacteria off that piece of organic matter and eating them. So I always liken it to the orca whale bashing into icebergs to knock off seals. And these other images that are just going past now are also images of the things that you find in soil. Incredible diversity, and hopefully people will start to appreciate that this is a living ecosystem with massive diversity. And the last slide there, this is looks like a fungus here. There's lots of filaments. It's actually a giant amoeba. Very, very delicate, very difficult to observe in the soil. You need to be very patient, allow it to grow. But again, it demonstrates that if you disturb soil, you're going to lose this type of growth. So disturbance is something we need to think very carefully about with soil. So, and it's called a vampirolid because it sucks the contents out of fungal spores and things like that. Anyway, that's a digression into the inner space of soil. I now want to go back to the urgency of the climate crisis. And you may have seen this graph, and it shows the mitigation curves that we need to invoke in order to avoid disaster with climate. And this is the early part of the graph shows an ever increasing CO2 emissions. And somehow or other, we've got to turn that around and make that go down. We've never ever done it for the last few decades. And even with COVID-19, we're unlikely to reduce emissions by enough to actually change trajectory in the climate crisis. So all of a sudden, we've got a long-term problem. It's a very short-term problem. Some people are saying we've only got 10 years in which to change this around. So the solutions we're looking for have to be different. Now, the next graph is a bit complicated in the sense there's a lot of text on it, but I'll talk you through it. Now, in terms of climate change, there's lots of things you can do. You can look at planting different types of plants, nutrient and canopy management, but actually these are all small incremental adaptations. It's too late for them. We need to be going for systems adaptation and transformational adaptation. So we need to be fundamentally changing our land uses. We need to be fundamentally changing the kind of crops that we actually grow. And some of the text in purple there are some of the things that we're starting to work on, things like indoor vertical farming. I'll say something about that. But also using agroecology, much more integrated land use with trees into agricultural land. And also breeding things like heat-tolerant potato, because the world's going to be warmer. If we want to keep growing potatoes, we're going to need potatoes to be heat-tolerant. So we need to adapt at the same time as we tackle the actual problem. And this next graph shows you the variation in rainfall in Scotland. It's a bit depressing because the first thing it does, this is the total amount of water that falls in Scotland over this period of time. These numbers are absolutely enormous, 140 billion cubic metres of water. So that sounds like a lot of rain, but you've always got to remember that today's rain is tomorrow's whiskey, so don't ever get depressed about it. But what you see over time is the rainfall's going up. And what you also see is that the variation between wet years and dry years is also going up. So whatever we do in terms of land management, we need to adapt to this because it's going to continue like this. And again, soils are really important. I don't know if you remember, I said there's 40 billion cubic metres of soil in the top 1 metres. That's equivalent to the arrow in orange there. That's not far away from the total variation that you get from within years. So making sure that our soils store water is good for drought years and it's good for flood years as well. And the best way to get more water stored in the soil is to increase the organic matter and manage them to store these things. So you're starting to think that actually the functions of soils around storing and regulating are maybe more important than food production. And maybe we can't afford to actually use our soils just for food production. So one of the things we need to do is to think very differently about how we organise our landscapes and our farm management systems. Now, this is a complicated graph. I'm not going to go through it all, but basically what I want to show you is that we're moving away from this bottom left-hand corner from the sort of high input chemical, large field intensive agriculture to much more diverse landscapes, which are designed with diversity back in them. And what this will do is localise food production. It will increase biodiversity and it will increase all the ecosystem functions and can help to grow the natural capital of our soil. So we're starting to work on a lot more of these things. We're also starting to work on something called indoor vertical farming. And I don't know where to plot it on this graph. And I won't explain why, but it's complicated. But I'll say a bit about why that is. But indoor vertical farming is another transformative technology that's maybe available to us to tackle climate change. But before I talk about that, I just want to talk about one aspect of our farm at Glenshaw. And here what we're trying to do is to grow the natural capital and be climate positive with our farm. We're trying to change the whole farm. So we're doing everything we can on this farm to change the way in which it's operated. So we're doubling the area of woodland. We're using agroforestry, which is these space trees that you can see with sheep grazing in between. And planting a lot more trees is going to sequester carbon and help promote biodiversity. But it's also about looking at on-farm renewables and hydrogen fuel generation and reducing livestock numbers, reducing fertiliser, and having different types of grazing, such as tall grass grazing, and making sure that our livestock are only fed 100% grass, so that we reduce the imports of feeds. So we're doing that at a whole system level, and our job is not to advocate or promote these things. Our job is to test them and see whether they actually work. So that's quite a big project for us. And the second one I wanted to talk about was the vertical farming initiatives. And this is a picture courtesy of Intelligent Growth Solutions Limited. They've actually built the very first vertical farm in Scotland, in Magowrie, and it's also the most advanced in the UK. And I'm going to show you a video of how this works in a minute, but basically it's using lots of technology, tunable precision LED lights, artificial intelligence, smart sensors for plant growth, smart energy management systems, robotics, and from us, plant breeding science. And what it means is that with these new systems, we can grow food all year round. We can grow food locally. It's independent of the weather. It's independent of the land. And you think about the pressure on land, the changing weather, that's really, really important. It can also reduce wastes enormously because it's very efficient, and it can reduce agrochemicals. In fact, you can have no agrochemicals in it whatsoever because it's totally contained and hygienic. And it's very complementary to the growth in the renewable energy sector. But energy costs are its biggest cost. This company have done some very clever things with the energy to bring them down. Now, the next one is going to be tricky because it's a video, but I'm hoping this is going to work. So this is the facility at Magowrie. So hopefully that's given you an idea of how that works. I'm happy to answer questions on that in more detail later on. But here's a big idea. We've got 40,000 hectares of vacant derelict land in the UK, mainly in urban areas adjacent to disadvantaged people. What if we could flip all that derelict and vacant land to grow food and spare other land that is currently used for food? That would be a big idea. And we think it's possible, actually. You look at the numbers in terms of the hectareage, because indoor vertical farming has got a land equivalency of 100 times that of agricultural land. Because you're growing multiple crops in the year, they're all stacked up and they're growing faster. For some crops, you can get 10 crops a year. So the multiplier is absolutely enormous. So with a much smaller area of derelict or vacant land, you could grow an awful lot of food. So we think there's huge potential in this, and it could be really transformative. And we also think that rather than just the big companies owning these indoor vertical farms, there's no reason why local communities couldn't own them as well. If you look at some urban area around Glasgow, so the shipyards in near Glasgow, obviously land use changes over time. There's residential areas now, but why couldn't you have a vertical farm there, which is owned by a community here, which is supplying to Tesco, where people do their shopping? There's a whole new way to think about all of this growing of food in urban environments. So it's given you a flavour of some of the things we're actually doing. I'm going to just move on now to talking about soil in relation to the urban context. And I'm not going to do all the work here. I'm going to ask you some questions as well. But these are some of the questions that I was asked by Becca, and I'm going to touch on some of them, but not all. The first thing is defining a healthy soil. For me, soil health is about the capacity of soil to function as a vital living system. It's got to have life in it. And a healthy soil supports abundant life, plants, animals, microbes, but it also has low levels of contaminants, pests, and pathogens. And it's got this ability to store and regulate and filter and purify. And that's my definition. But if we don't have enough soil, how do we get it? And we have done some experimentation on this about trying to make new soils. So taking, for example, construction fines, mixing it with green compost, you can get something you can grow plants in. Absolutely no problem. And that's just a description of the experiment in that slide. Briefly, I'll say the result is that this is the controlled soil at the end here. And in terms of plant growth, you can get plenty of plant growth, absolutely no problem at all by this mixture. But when you start to look at the regulating functions, you can start to see differences because of the mineralogy of the concrete and that's been used, or the construction fines. So that regulating function in terms of things which leach out into waters, etc., can be very dramatically different compared to a natural soil. So it all comes down to what function do you want it to perform where you have it in your garden or in your urban area. But in principle, you really need to get that organic matter and the minerals to promote plant productivity, build and grow the life in your soil, and maximise those ecological functions it can perform. No dig and no till is becoming increasingly popular. I'm sure you've heard about that. And it will also help promote the life in the soil, but you must keep that life fed by growing plants and organic mulch. And that will give you the porosity and the water retention that you need to be resilient in your garden or in an urban environment. And I actually think that if the starting material is low in contaminants and pests and diseases, there's no reason why we shouldn't be incorporating food growing into garden design or urban areas at all. And a lot of people are now doing this. You've got all sorts of guerrilla gardening going on, etc. And if you get that soil right, there's no reason why you can't do it. So for me, and I'm just going to turn to this slide, it's about the balance of functions. And for urban soils or garden soils, you have to decide what you want first, and that will determine how you manage it. Do you want it to maximize biomass production, or actually you're more interested in supporting all the biodiversity and the ability to filter things in that soil? So I guess I'd be interested to know what you think are the most important functions in terms of garden design and or in urban design. So I don't work in your area, so I'd love to hear what you think about all of that. So I'm going to finish there. I've just got a few thanks to many colleagues at the James Hutton Institute, and I'll move to question and answers. But before I do, I'll just point out we do have a magazine called Hutton Highlights. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to that, electronic Hutton Highlights, and keep you up to date with everything we're doing. And in the slide pack that I hand over to Becca, Rachel, etc., I will include some offline reference material. And if you ever want to look at life in the soil, this is a great book. It's called the European Atlas of Soil Biodiversity. Absolutely stunning, amazing photographs of life in soil. And all the photographs are free to use, as I've done. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it stimulates some questions, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Colin. Yeah, very interesting. I suppose, could I start the ball rolling with questions and ask? I know certainly chatting to clients and things, they're very keen to feed their plants as much as possible and fertilize them, and what your comments are in terms of how we should be maybe looking after our plants and soil from that perspective.
Yeah, again, I think it depends what you're trying to achieve. And I mean, obviously, if you take a market garden where you're trying to achieve, high quality produce, you're going to want to do what the farmers are doing, and that has been putting on a lot of fertilizer and maximizing the growth and productivity of your garden. But if what you want to do is encourage biodiversity in your garden, you may take a different approach. It may not be about the production; it may be about the diversity of plants and where you plant them might be more important, and the way in particular you manage the organic matter. Because remember,
Frozen.
a connected food web. So if you're trying to promote the biodiversity and life in your garden, you really need to think about the organic matter and how you're managing that, and maybe maximizing plant productivity is not what you want to do.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Mel.
Sorry, just on mute. Yeah, as designers, we are often faced with heavily compacted soil at the end of a build project. Is it better to, from that point onwards, to mechanically decompact soil to start with, or is it better to say it's going to take a while, but we're going to improve it by not mechanically doing anything more to it and adding organic matter and just giving it time?
Yeah, I mean, again, the first thing is to consider the hydrological connections with the rest of the area around about you, because obviously compacted layers can fast track water at that depth out of the system, and breaking it might change the hydrological pathways, which you need to be clear about. Where is it going to go if it's not getting through? If it does get through that compacted layer, but if you've got good drainage characteristics, good water retention, and you need to break that compacted layer in terms of particularly tree roots, it's a good idea to think about how to break through that. And again, in agriculture, we would do that with all sorts of devices where you can break it up. You can rip it so that it's not completely broken, but allows access for roots. And if there are gaps there, roots will always find a way through if they have to. And once the roots start to get through, they do start a kind of natural process of breaking up that as well, because they grow, they put organic matter there, and that helps to break it up. But it very does depend on the sort of hydrological connectivity and whether you need to do it in order to establish that plant growth, what type of plant growth. Clearly, if you've got shallow plants, but you've got a very good soil that's not going to dry out, it may be unnecessary to disturb it.
Yes, that's a really important question, isn't it? Anyone else?
Apologies, I'm multitasking at the moment. It's Chinton here. I was just wondering about biochar and what you think about it as an application to soil in terms of improving it. And obviously also, you've got things like Gardener's World suggesting, being quite out there in terms of their don't use using peat-free compost. What composts are there that you would recommend? Because they're few and far between if you go to the garden centre.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important topic for gardeners in particular around composts. I mean, clearly we don't want people using peat, but the reality.
No. It's a shame.
Maybe.
Colin, you're frozen again. You can hear us.
That what we need to do is start growing compost.
Colin, sorry, you cut out at the key moment. Would you be able to repeat your answer?
Yeah, so I'll maybe just start at the beginning if that's okay. Yeah, so we think there's going to be growing demand for composts, and even though there are possible replacements like Koya, which is pretty good. It's used in the indoor vertical farm, for example, Koya, but it's got supply and demand problems as well, and it comes from a long way away for a start. So we do need to find alternatives, and there will be increasing demand. So strawberry growers in the US are starting to switch to compost from soil. So you can see straight away there's more and more demand for compost. So much so, in fact, that we've thought about whether we should be growing crops that you use to make compost, which sounds crazy in a way, but actually it's not. It's actually very sensible because it's got all the plant. It's potentially a high value product future, and it's if you're growing it in a good soil, it's going to be really clean. If you have compost from waste and byproduct streams associated with organic residues, what you tend to find is they're inevitably contaminated with something. So I think there's a whole new area that needs to be looked at in terms of compost supply and how we make composts going forward. And yeah, I don't have an issue with the idea that we should maybe be growing plants or crops to make compost in the future.
Are there any crops that double up as compost? Can you multi?
Well, I mean, clearly a lot of our cereals are producing straw, but that's highly valued by livestock farmers, and indeed they're used for insulation. But there's a lot of other fibre crops, so things like hemp is a fantastic fibre crop, very productive, produces a huge amount of fibre that you can harvest. And there's other things that you can get from the hemp in terms of seed for protein, for example. Clearly, you need to have a hemp which has got very low levels of any hallucinatory drugs, but it's a very viable crop potentially for us in the future to have sort of a biological material for all sorts of things, including compost.
Can I ask a quick question about what do you think about
municipal green manure. I mean, I'm not sure that it's, but as an organic matter, inert or theoretically inert organic matter, we tend to use it for, you know, where we're on clay. I'm southeast of England and we're on quite a lot of clay, so quite often there's a need to just get organic matter into the ground, you know, and so for cost reasons.
Yeah, it'll be very good. It'll be very effective, I think, in terms of solving that problem. I think the thing about municipal compost is that you don't necessarily know what's going into it. We've done a fair bit of work on this in relation to weed species. Even though there are weeds that are regulated, sometimes they do find their way in. So you need to ensure that it is properly accredited. And of course, there is a whole process of accreditation for municipal green waste now, which is very good. You inevitably will still find there are things can get into it that are used in gardens, people who are using herbicides, for example, and for some reason, zinc levels seem to be quite high in green compost. We haven't got to the bottom of why that is. And therefore, if you're using it continuously in the same place, that you do run a long-term risk of building up these kinds of things in your soil. But I think as people realise how valuable it is, it will only improve over time, and we'll see better and better sort of green waste compost sort of coming on the market.
So in a sort of long term, let's say we're looking at a garden long term, and we start off with a kind of, you know, clay, and then we add a municipal green waste. My feeling is you can't keep adding the same thing over and over again, because otherwise you kind of get this excess of one thing. So, you know, people bark chip all the time. It's like, okay, that's great, but then you're actually changing and not necessarily taking account of what's coming with that. Do you think there's a sort of optimal rotation of things to add, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely if you've got options with different types of organic matter that you can add, and you're aware of the different benefits of it. So, I mean, animal manures are going to have kind of high nitrogen content, phosphorus. These are all good for the soil. We know cattle manure, horse dung is all really good for the garden. You know, where you've got wood chips, which have got a very low amount of nitrogen. If you put too much wood chips on, you'll actually start to lock up the nitrogen in the soil. It's good for drainage, and you have to match the organic matter to the soil type. So this is where heavy clay soils, you want to get organic matter in there. Wood chips might be quite a good option there, but you need to balance the nutrient content so that you don't immobilize the nitrogen and plants can't take it up. So there, you know, it's about a balance between the different organic amendments. And again, where we're starting to think that what would make life a lot easier for everybody was if we actually designed the composts to be the best possible for different purposes, so that you always had a bit of this and a bit of that. You knew what you were getting and you knew where you should apply it. The industry is incredibly immature about that at the moment. On one hand, you've got very sophisticated biochar products being sold for putting around the base of trees and amenity woodland, which has all sorts of biological benefits, it's claimed. On the other hand, people are just using whatever they can get hold of. So I think we need to mature a lot as an industry in terms of actually providing the kind of right materials that suit the right soil type. Because even if you're in a garden, you're largely going to have the soil that is in a characteristic of that particular part of the country, and will be determined by the inherent soil properties of that region. So you need to match the organic mulch or material to the particular soil type.
And also testing is something that I often think, you know, we get these, you know, silly little things that you can buy on Amazon, and I often look at them and think, is that really giving me I mean, it gives me the pH, and sometimes you can tell, you know, to actually do a core test and say, well, it's got these nutrients and it hasn't got these nutrients, and I really know what I'm missing, or I'm not sure that that's possible for the amateur gardener, or even us as sort of professionals, as a sort of realistic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, soil testing and in agriculture is a fairly routine thing. It's done quite a lot by consultants and companies who are trying to sell fertilizer to the farmer. And I do have a bit of an issue with that, because quite often they measure the wrong thing and they only recommend what they're selling. And they don't often recommend organic matter, which is what a lot of farmers should be having, and nobody sells them organic matter anymore. although again, I think that could change. Farmers used to trade manure amongst themselves, and I do wonder whether that needs to come back in actually. But the soil tests that you can buy are generally okay. I mean, you don't necessarily need a lot of precision. What you need is some sort of accuracy within this kind of thresholds and ranges that you're looking for, because often you're trying to establish things, you're not necessarily trying to maximise growth or get it right. So, and soil pH for gardens is probably one of the biggest things that you need to understand in relation to growing plants in particular. And the tests for that are relatively okay, because you're operating within a threshold of ranges that are good or bad for different types of plants. I wish we were developing better soil testing kits. I mean, we've got a whole range of sophisticated methods for measuring soils, but they're not suitable for sort of rapid deployment yet. But I can see technology coming on that will do that eventually. There's all sorts of portable laser devices and scanners and things that are starting to come along, which may be able to do that for you in the future.
There's a lot of questions that have come into the chat box. It might be worth look through those. Heather Dale, who's up in Aberdeen, says in the carbon balanced farm, trees growing are a big carbon sink in the system. When those are felled, does that impact on the carbon balance of the farm in a negative way, or does it depend on the wood use?
Yeah, it does. You're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, you're sequestering carbon when the tree's growing, but when you take it down, it depends on what you use that tree for. If you burn it in biomass, you're releasing the CO2. But if it's going into wood construction, which I think is one of your next talks, you can build skyscrapers with wood nowadays. So if you put it into there, you've still sunk carbon. So it very much depends on the use of those trees. But even taking off the top of a tree, sometimes more than 50% of the biomass is still in the ground. And if you don't dig up the roots, all that carbon is locked in there for a very, very long time. So it's still a very good way of sequestering carbon, even on a very long-term scale. I think you do have to be careful about disturbance when you plant the trees. That can have quite a big effect. So if you plough up the soil before you plant, for example, you're releasing a lot of carbon. So you reduce the carbon benefit you get from the tree. Again, I would recommend minimal disturbance when planting if you can get away with it. It's not always possible. And the type of tree you plant has a massive effect. But again, it depends what you want. You can have a very fast growing Douglas fir tree, which will sequester a lot of carbon, but it's not going to do a lot for your biodiversity. You could go for a slower growing oak, get a lot of carbon over a longer period of time, but get a lot of biodiversity benefit. And then we need to make sure we're getting the right tree in the right place for the right reason.
Is there any way to find that out? Is there a resource for that?
There's a lot of information available on this from Forest Commission, from commercial tree planters. A lot of people understand all these things. We've recently developed a way of calculating how much carbon trees sequester on a Scottish level. That is across the whole country, but it's using quite sophisticated mathematical models. We probably will eventually. That is available on as a online and free to use. But we are trying to produce more and more of these things as apps, because quite often it's what do you do about the information you get rather than how do you get the information. A bit like the last questioner, it's using the information you get wisely is the real trick.
Could you say something about the interaction between herbicides, pesticides, and their breakdown product and soil?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge scientific literature on the degradation of pesticides and herbicides. And over the last 30 years, with the kind of horrors of the early years of agrochemicals, we've moved towards, much safer agrochemicals, some of which can degrade very quickly in soil. But what's complicated is that not often just the chemical that you think is the active ingredient. There's other formulations there. So it's very difficult to be categorical about exactly when something's going to degrade. And again, it depends on the soil type. It will vary with soil type. It will depend on the life in the soil, how quickly it degrades. So as much as everybody follows good practice and can use them safely, it will vary from place to place. And it's virtually impossible to measure all the variables that can give you absolute certainty about how long they degrade. But many of the modern agrochemicals degrade quite fast. In fact, some of them don't even get into the soil, they're degraded in the plant.
We often have issues with glyphosate in particular. Should we be not touching it with a barge pole, or saying actually glyphosate is better than digging?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, glyphosate, there's a lot of controversy with glyphosate just now, which you're probably aware of. And it comes down to sometimes differences in formulations, I think. I mean, if you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said glyphosate is a miracle agrochemical. It's really, really good, degrades in the plant, causes very little issues in the soils. There's a bit of evidence that it's not all as it seems just now, but I've not seen a really definitive case against glyphosate yet, and it is one of these topics that really divides people, and I think there needs to be a lot more study on it to be absolutely clear about it. But it is clearly very effective in terms of weed control. But if you can control weeds with physical methods, and there's a lot of interest in using steam and heat, these can be very effective, and you're running no risk of chemical contamination. Even better if you can find a way of mulching weeds and controlling them that way, because you're putting all of the organic matter from the weed back in the soil. And another school of thought is that you should actually tolerate weeds. They are part of the diversity of the garden.
I welcome them.
On the topic of mulches, Tracy Richards said, are there any problems with putting very thick mulches up to 200 mils of gravel or bark on top of the soil?
Yeah, I'm going to be, again, avoid this slightly. I mean, it does very much depend on the soil. 200 millimeters is quite a lot. You're creating a bit of a bioreactor on top of the soil there itself. You know, I mean, have you ever heard of wood chip corrals? This is where livestock are around barns and things, where you create a corral which is entirely wood chips, or sometimes they use rubber tires as well, actually, or chipped rubber tires. Wood chip corrals have got a habit of turning into what we call denitrification reactors. They actually can release nitrogen fertilizer because you've created a very wet, carbon-rich environment where nitrous oxide can be emitted. So I think it's like a lot of things. You need to find the right balance. It will depend very much on the soil type and the physical strength of the soil as well. So I'm not an expert, but it sounds like a lot to me, 200 millimeters. But
can I ask about vertical farms?
Yes.
Fascinating talk, by the way, particularly the soil biodiversity. It's really interesting. Thank you for that. Can you say a few words on how they compare to, say, vertical farms to, say an allotment or a market garden? In terms of the social side of it, the biodiversity, the production? Because, yeah, I think that'd be interesting. Yeah,
I mean, you're focused in there on what is probably the biggest differentiator at the moment. On one hand, you've got these kind of factory style indoor vertical farms where robots go in and take out the growing plants and nobody's involved in it. And then you've got people who are getting their hands dirty and they're cultivating the plants themselves. And that's a completely different experience. And in terms of health and well-being, so hands-on is really important. And there are a lot of benefits from growing your own food. Clearly, in terms of productivity, indoor vertical farms are going to outstrip allotments. There could also be differences in the micronutrients, but these can be manipulated in an indoor vertical farm. But actually, a lot of people producing indoor vertical farms are talking about how does every individual have their own indoor vertical farm? I mean, IKEA are investing in this big time. They already have a herb growing kit for the domestic market. And they have this idea that you will not have a fridge one day. You'll have something that looks like a fridge, but when you open it up, it's growing plants. It's growing your herbs and growing your crops. It sounds very fanciful, but just because you're using technology doesn't mean to say you can't get joy and meaningfulness out of growing plants. But it's very different from the interactions you would get, say, down at an allotment. Yeah. And it's not ever going to approach that kind of community side of it, unless it's the community that owns the indoor vertical farm and people are on their mobile phones and checking about how things are growing and what they're going to grow next week versus what they're going to grow this week. So it's a very different world, I think.
I think also, I read a study somewhere that that allotments are one of the most biodiverse habitats in the country. So, and the vertical farms looked a little bit sanitized and industrial. So there's that to consider as well, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, allotments will certainly have a lot more diversity, and they can also sequester a lot of carbon. There have been some studies done on that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the vertical farms are obviously growing plants, 10 times, maybe 100 times more, so they can sequester more carbon that way. But they don't necessarily have all these other things like the social interactions and community involvement. So it depends why you're doing it. I mean, I think for me, one of the issues we have in the future with climate change is that we may not have an option to grow food in indoor vertical farms, because even allotments are going to struggle in some years. The climate is going to get more variable. We're seeing more and more flood years, more and more drought years, and we maybe need a bit of an insurance policy around indoor growing to make sure that we can produce enough food. But I'm a big fan of allotments and small farming approaches as well. I think it's a bit of a myth that they can't produce enough food. And with the right approach, they can actually produce enough food if we eat less. The problem is we eat too much and we waste too much. So I don't think for me, there's not necessarily an issue about scaling just to produce food. You can scale down the way and get a lot more benefit from it.
I suppose a suite of all different types of approaches would be.
Yeah.
A few more questions in the chat room. There's, I don't know, Alenthea has said some garden design trends have been about planting drought-tolerant Mediterranean plants, which are, I guess, relevant in these times of climate change. But they take up less carbon. Should we be trying to focus on native species?
I hate to sort of keep repeating myself in a way that it does depend what you're trying to achieve. I mean, if you're trying to promote that biodiversity, you obviously want to grow native plants. But if it's the difference between anything growing there and nothing growing there, you may have to have Mediterranean plants going forward. And obviously, there's a lot more in garden design and urban design than growing the plant. It's about the aesthetic value. It may be that in some areas having Mediterranean plants is very much appreciated by people because it's different from what they're seeing elsewhere. So it's not a straight yes or no, but there's no doubt that one of the biggest pressures in the future will be around keeping things alive in drought years. So I wouldn't be against having tolerant plants. Having any plant's probably better than having no plant.
You're also saying that the rainfall's going up, so that might not tie in with Mediterranean dry plants so much as tolerant plants, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you will have wetter years, and it will fluctuate from year to year, and that fluctuation will get greater over time. And this is where we need to think about it in those terms: is what do we want as a resilient system? So in farming, we're going to get variable weather, and we'll get variable yields. But actually, if we maybe grew things in a different way, we could have less yield, but a more stable and predictable yield. That might be a better way of actually farming and adapting to the future climate change. And you could extrapolate that to garden design as well, that you're not always going to get the bumper year, but you'll get more average years if you put more organic matter in the soil so that it copes when it's a dry year, and you've got good drainage so that it copes when it's a wet year. But we're not going to have any choice in that. That is very likely to happen, so we need to plan for it.
Yeah, that sounds important. I think we're running quite fast out of time. There's a couple more questions about whether farmyard manures contain pesticides.
Yeah, I mean, they can do. I mean, farmyard manures ideally should be composted before they leave the farmyard, or be composted and then used. Composting is a fantastic process. The heat and the microbial life in there kills and degrades an awful lot of the things in much the same way that soil does. So if you can prefer to, I would always use a composted material or a treated material. You will have far less risks with it.
Just skimming through the thoughts on reintroduction of neonicotinoids.
Yeah, again, another massively contested issue. So the question is really about the reintroduction of neonics in South East England. Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully up to date on the literature on this. I've got a colleague who's an agroecologist who is, and there is a lot of concern about neonics and what they might be doing within the food web. But it is a balance against, you know, again, getting some production from fields. So it's a real tricky one. Just reading the question properly, it's also talking about regeneration of the soil. And of course, the sort of the big thesis around regenerating soils is that you can use less pesticides because you have a different system. If you have more biodiversity, you may have more predators that feed on aphids or other pests and diseases. If you have more organic matter in your soil, you have a better microbial population, and it can avoid using various fungicides, etc. And you have healthier plants. So regeneration is a really important strategy. It's something we're doing a lot of research on in terms of integrated pest management and alternative ways of designing diversity back into the system. But regenerating the soil will take several years, but you'd be amazed at how many farmers report how quickly they see a difference, you know, sort of 3 to 5 years. And certainly after 10 to 15 years, they notice a difference right across their farm if they go for that kind of regeneration option. I'm not advocating it, I'm stating you what the observations are and the evidence is. So it's not necessarily something that's going to take a long time in terms of the benefits that you're looking for. I'm just trying to make sure I've answered all of the question because there's more there.
I know they keep coming in, don't they?
There's some answers there.
Yeah, so,
can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah,
Sorry, talk about organic matter, and there's different soil types. Should all soil types have organic matter added to them? So if we're, you know, work in different parts of the country or what have you, or even different parts of like Helensburgh where I am, you know, down by the we've got quite sandy soil with good on top and very clayey and stony at the top. So should we be adding organic matter to everything?
Not necessarily. I mean, some of these habitats, like the kind of sandy soils that you find on coastlines, are very rare actually, and very valuable because they support particular types of biodiversity. Adding the wrong type of organic matter or any organic matter might be the worst thing you could do in terms of upsetting the balance of the type of biodiversity on that soil type. And wouldn't be a good idea if it changes the soil pH, for example, which is one of the main drivers of that biodiversity. So it's something to really check very carefully. It doesn't mean to say they can't still sequester carbon, because if they are biodiverse and productive, the plants are sequestering carbon and they're introducing that carbon in the form that all the life in the soil expects. So it's not like you have to apply organic matter just to put carbon in the soil. The plants do it all the time. So managing the plants properly is a good thing in terms of carbon sequestration.
And when you say the wrong type of organic matter, are you talking specifically about nutrients and that it contains, as well as the pH as well? So
yeah, and the physical nature as well. Wood chips is going to change the drainage hugely. Other types of organic matter might change the drainage in the opposite direction. I mean, peat is fantastic at soaking up water, but adding it into a sandy soil is going to make it hold much more water. But do you want it to? For the purpose you're using it for, you may not want to do that. So yeah, you have to be very careful about how you're doing it. It's a really important to think of it as a whole ecosystem. What is it you're trying to achieve? And those soil types are so fundamentally different, you need to think carefully about how you manage it.
Really interesting. I know that I think we could go on for ages, but probably running fast out of time, and I'm sure everyone wants to go off and enjoy their evenings, particularly you, Colin. So no, thanks so much for answering all those questions. That really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, no, thank you for. I'm sorry I can't answer all of them actually, but there's some brilliant questions there, making me think about it. So
it does. It really makes you think. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you very much.
Not so. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Good luck with everything as well. Stay safe.
Thanks so much.